Even though I was the one who personally put Miriam behind bars, I still find myself habitually picturing her wasting away in her cell every night. I even catch myself slowing down whenever I drive past the correctional facility, and after a few too many drinks at the pub, I end up whispering to an empty chair. I ask her, Mimi, if you had just used half of that manic energy to love me, would we ever have ended up like this? Nobody knows how long I stared at the backup folder of our old photos before I finally found the courage to delete it after my revenge was complete. They also don't understand why I refused to look for her mother, who went missing years ago. It isn't about avoiding justice, but rather about refusing to let myself get sucked back into that toxic cycle once more. I threw myself back into business, investments, and traveling, trying to soak in every view the world had to offer. Yet, on certain nights, I still wake up breathless because of her, dreaming of how she looks so radiant while lecturing at the university. In those dreams, she still looks at me with that familiar disdain, only to become impossibly soft when we were alone together. I never remarried, and I never went to visit her, because I believe that once certain debts are settled, you have to bury that entire chapter of your life along with them. My wife, Miriam Miller, was a nearly perfect woman who was stunningly beautiful and possessed a sophisticated, icy grace as a university professor. Despite her beauty, she never loved me. She constantly reminded me that her biggest regret in life was marrying an unrefined upstart like myself. To be fair, she wasn't wrong, as I truly was just a lucky man with a modest education who happened to hit the jackpot during a few market booms. I was basically the poster child for being in the right place at the right time, like a guy who won the lottery without trying. I was just a regular guy who got swept up in a whirlwind of sudden wealth. After we tied the knot, Miriam became impossible to please, constantly criticizing my lack of refinement and calling me uncultured. Even with all her nagging and condescension, the thought of getting a divorce never once crossed my mind. I was too busy trying to prove I was worthy of her. She was breathtakingly beautiful, highly educated, and held a prestigious career, representing exactly the kind of intellectual woman I had always put on a pedestal. Beyond her public persona, there was a hidden side to her. Although she appeared cold and untouchable to the world, she became incredibly vulnerable and passionate behind closed doors, which made her completely intoxicating. That intoxicating mix of conquest and contrast was a high I couldn't walk away from once I'd experienced it. I was so utterly spellbound by her that I convinced myself I could endure any amount of verbal abuse just to keep our life together. I really thought we could just keep going like that forever. Everything changed in our third year of marriage when Joey Thompson entered the picture and Miriam quickly fell for his smooth, persistent charms. I braced myself for the end, assuming our marriage would simply conclude with a standard divorce settlement. I was prepared to sign the papers and walk away. I never could have imagined that they weren't just after a divorce. They wanted my entire fortune and my life along with it. These two brilliant individuals teamed up against me while I was completely blindsided, taking everything I owned with terrifying ease. I was a lamb to the slaughter. I lost every cent I had, ending up not just broke, but buried under a mountain of soul-crushing debt. With nowhere left to turn and my heart filled with nothing but pure hatred, I climbed to the roof of a skyscraper and threw myself off the edge. I just couldn't take the betrayal anymore. I'll admit it, I wasn't smart enough to beat you at your own game back then. But if the universe ever gives me a second shot at this, you better be ready for what's coming. I won't be so easy to crush next time. I couldn't believe my luck had actually turned around so drastically, but the universe really did give me a redo. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back on the exact day I made my first big killing in the stock market. It was like a dream come true. Staring at the long string of zeros in my brokerage account, I actually started crying right then and there. It was absolutely surreal. After everything I'd been through, Edward Garrison was back at the beginning of my golden age. I was right back at the peak of my prime, before everything went south. I sat down and crunched the numbers on the timeline, realizing I had 3 full years before I was even supposed to meet Miriam. That was more than enough time to prepare. This time around, I'm gonna make sure they pay back every single thing they owe me with interest. Once I had made up my mind, I started mapping out exactly how I was going to get my revenge. It was going to be a long game. Miriam used to look down on me for being a vulgar, uneducated upstart, didn't she? Well, fine. This time I'm going to show her that a supposedly unrefined guy like me can play her like a fiddle. I went straight to a high-end educational consultant and submitted my application for grad school. The consultant looked over my paperwork, noted my age, and frowned. He asked if I thought 24 might be a little late to start. I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone and showed him the balance in my savings account. I asked him if he still thought I was too old. He immediately changed his tune, bowing slightly and grinning like a maniac while telling me me age was just a number. He promised to get me into Stanford for a master's degree right away, saying it wouldn't be an issue at all. However, he hesitated as if he wanted to say something else, which started to get on my nerves. I snapped at him and asked if there was a problem. He finally spit it out, telling me I need to donate about $50 million to fund a new lab at Stanford. My heart skipped a beat and I nearly choked on my coffee. I nervously asked if he meant $50 million US dollars. He shook his head with a laugh and told me it was in Chinese currency, which made me breathe a massive sigh of relief. I told him I'd donate 2 labs instead, and we could put his agency's name on one of them. He looked like he had just won the lottery. His face lit up with a massive, wrinkled grin that looked like a blooming flower. By the very next day, I was on a flight heading straight to California. I didn't want to waste a single second. The moment I landed, a private driver was waiting for me at the gate with my name on a sign. He drove me directly to a stunning luxury villa right next to the Stanford campus. The place was fully furnished and ready for me to move in immediately. I didn't waste any time unpacking before heading straight to the university to register. I had been very calculated about my major, choosing life sciences specifically so that I would have plenty in common with Miriam when we met. I needed to speak her language. College life was a bit of a grind, but I didn't let myself slack off for even a second, attending every single lecture without fail. I wore high-end translation earpieces during my classes and took meticulous notes on everything the professor said. I was determined to actually learn the material this time. To make it easier to participate in group discussions, I decided to buy translation headsets for everyone in my cohort. My classmates and professors were incredibly impressed by my generosity, and they really respected the way I was working my tail off to bridge the language gap. I became the most popular guy in the department overnight. I was genuinely putting in the work because I wanted this life to be different from the last one. I realized I couldn't just live for revenge. I needed to actually build a life of substance and depth. I wanted to be more than just a man with a bank account. There's an old saying that even a pig can fly if the wind is strong enough. But once the wind dies down, those pigs are the first ones to hit the ground and die. I was determined not to be one of those pigs this time around. I didn't turn into some anti-social bookworm, though, and I made sure my social life was just as active as my studies. The California sun was intense, the beaches were stunning, and the girls were absolutely gorgeous. I was definitely making the most of my time in the States. The only real downside was that it was impossible to find a truly authentic bowl of beef noodle soup anywhere near Palo Alto. Aside from that craving, my new life was pretty much perfect in every way. I felt like a completely different man. Whenever I had a break from my studies, I loved heading to the coast to just lay on the sand and clear my head. I made a point to stay in great shape, too, spending plenty of time at the gym. I knew how much appearance mattered in the world I was going back to. In my previous life, Miriam might not have loved me, but she never turned me down in the bedroom. I had a feeling that if I'd been some out-of-shape, greasy businessman with a beer belly, she wouldn't have let me anywhere near her. I wasn't going to take any chances this time. The girls in California were incredibly outgoing and would often come up to strike up a conversation with me. Once I accidentally let them catch a glimpse of my bank balance on my phone, their interest level always spiked significantly. It was a shallow but effective way to navigate the social scene. So my days were spent studying biology in the lab, while my nights were spent exploring the biological mysteries of the local nightlife. I kept up that pace for 3 years until I finally walked across the stage with my master's degree. I was finally ready to return home. When it was finally time to head back, I had to say some emotional goodbyes to Jennifer, Brittany, Sarah, and the rest of the girls I'd been seeing. I felt a bit worn out from all the late nights, but I gathered my things and boarded my flight to Boston. It was time to start the real mission. Stepping back onto familiar ground felt like a surge of adrenaline hitting my system. Looking at my reflection in the airport restroom mirror, I realized that the man staring back was unrecognizable from the person who had left 3 years ago. I looked like I belonged in a completely different social class. I had a sharp, modern haircut and wore sophisticated gold-rimmed glasses that gave me a polished, intellectual look. I stood taller now, with a steady gaze and a refined air that made it obvious I was well educated. I had successfully shed my former image as a crude upstart. I was really happy with my new look. After taking a few days to get settled back home, I made my way over to Boston University where Miriam was teaching. If my memory of the timeline was correct, her father's health was just about to take a turn for the worse. In my previous life, her father had been diagnosed with lung cancer and desperately wanted to seek treatment in the States, but her family was completely broke. Miriam had essentially sold herself to me, agreeing to marriage only if I picked up the tab for every single medical expense. I had been her only financial lifeline. Back then, I was such a fool that I didn't just pay the hospital bills. I bought her parents a mansion and a luxury SUV as well. I bankrolled their entire lifestyle, from their designer clothes to their high-end vacations. I thought I was buying their love. I did all of that just hoping to earn a tiny shred of respect from Miriam and her parents. In reality, they never even saw me as a person, just a walking ATM. They took everything I gave them while looking down their noses at me the whole time. Thinking back on it now still makes my blood boil. They were living large on my dime while constantly belittling me behind my back. Her mother even had the nerve to tell people that I should be grateful she let Miriam marry me, as if she were doing me some kind of massive favor. Looking back, it was clearly their lucky day when I came along to save them. Her father was the worst of them all because the second his health stabilized, he went right back to treating me like trash. He was an ungrateful old man who only valued me for my money. He would tell Miriam that I wasn't good enough for their family while simultaneously pressuring her to divorce me and take half my assets. Just the memory of his smug face makes me want to punch a wall. I'm not going to be their sucker this time. When I got to the university, I walked straight into the dean's office and handed him my recommendation letter from Stanford. He scanned the letter and then looked up to ask where I had done my undergraduate studies. I knew this was coming. I just shrugged because I'd never actually finished a bachelor's degree in my first life. The dean, Harrison, immediately understood the situation and cleared his throat awkwardly. He told me that Boston University typically had very strict requirements regarding undergraduate credentials for their faculty members. He started to explain how tricky my situation was, but I cut him off before he could finish. I told him I understood exactly how things worked and asked if a donation for a new research lab would help clear up any administrative issues. I knew money talked in these halls. Harrison's face instantly lit up with a wide, toothy grin that crinkled all the skin around his eyes. He told me I could start my orientation the very next morning. It was amazing how quickly tricky situations could be resolved with the right amount of cash. I walked into the faculty office the next morning wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. The very first person I locked eyes with was Miriam. It was the first time I had seen her since my life restarted and my heart hammered against my ribs. I froze for a split second when I saw her stunningly beautiful face again. The department chair began introducing me to the staff, telling everyone I was a Stanford grad who had studied under the famous Professor Andre. I tried to keep my expression neutral as he praised my credentials. He went on and on about my research while the other professors listened intently. I just stood there with a polite, humble smile, scanning the room while making sure my eyes occasionally lingered on Miriam. I wanted to make sure she noticed me without being too obvious. By the time the introduction was over, I could see Miriam's eyes brighten and her usual icy demeanor soften significantly. I had to laugh to myself, realizing that this was exactly why she had fallen for Joey so fast in the previous timeline. She clearly had a type, and now I was playing that role perfectly. I made a mental note that she and Joey wouldn't be getting any opportunities together in this life. Once the chair finished his speech, I made a point of staring directly at Miriam, acting like I was completely captivated by her looks. I wanted to play into her ego. The other professors in the room immediately started teasing me, laughing about how I had a good eye for beauty. One of them joked that I'd set my sights on the department's ice queen the moment I stepped through the door. The atmosphere in the office instantly became more relaxed. Miriam actually blushed, which was a rare sight, and I looked down at my shoes while feigning embarrassment. It was working out perfectly. This was exactly the kind of dynamic I wanted to create to get closer to her. Their teasing gave me the perfect excuse to start interacting with her more directly without looking suspicious. As per university tradition, my first lecture was an open session attended by the dean and the entire faculty. It was essentially an audition to prove I actually knew my stuff. They called a peer review, but everyone knew it was a test to see if I was a fraud or a genius. I walked into the lecture hall with total confidence, stepped up to the podium, and began a seamless, high-level technical presentation. I had rehearsed this for months. I had strategically chosen gene therapy as my topic, knowing it was Miriam's specific area of expertise. She was leaning forward in her seat, hanging on my every word with an intensity that made her eyes practically glow. I could tell I was winning her over. She kept nodding and taking notes, completely absorbed in the flow of my lecture. When the final bell rang, the entire room erupted in genuine, enthusiastic applause. I felt a surge of triumph I had never experienced in my first life. A wave of pure satisfaction washed over me because this was the kind of intellectual respect I had craved but never received before. All those sleepless nights studying in California had finally paid off. I was no longer just an upstart with a bank account. I was an equal. After the dean and the other professors filed out of the room, I stayed behind and pretended to be busy organizing my notes. I kept a close eye on Miriam, who was lingering by the door and looking like she wanted to say something. I waited for her to make the first move. Just as I expected, a soft, slightly shy voice broke the silence of the empty hall. She asked if I had a moment to answer a few questions about my presentation. I looked up and gave her my most charming, humble smile. I turned toward her and noticed the slight flush in her cheeks. I told her there was no need to be so formal and suggested she just call me Edward. I wanted to break down that professional barrier as quickly as possible. She hesitated for a second before saying my name, and when I gave her an encouraging nod, a tiny smile played on her lips. She told me I should stop calling her Professor Miller and suggested I use her first name instead. The ice was finally starting to melt. I decided to push my luck a little further and asked if I could call her Mimi. The blush on her face deepened instantly until she was practically glowing. It was a bold move, but I knew I could pull it off. I wasn't worried about being too aggressive, since I was playing the part of a confident guy fresh off the plane from California. When she looked down and gave me a quiet okay in that shy tone, a sudden wave of fury hit me. It was hard to keep my smile from turning into a sneer. In my first life, that scumbag Joey had called her Mimi constantly, and she had loved every second of it. Meanwhile, I had been her husband, but I was never even allowed to use that nickname. It was infuriating to think about how much I had been excluded from her heart. I remember the one time I had actually tried to call her Mimi back then, and she had snapped at me for an hour, telling me I was disgusting. The hypocrisy of it all was almost too much to bear. But now, the rules were different. It just went to show that people would let anyone they liked get close to them. I was the one who had sacrificed my fortune and my future for her family, yet I had been treated like I wasn't even worth her breath. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it fueled my resolve. Once the initial awkwardness passed, Miriam started asking me some technical questions about my research. They were relatively basic for someone with my training, so I was able to explain everything with ease. I could see her growing more impressed by the minute. As we walked back to the faculty lounge, I made sure we were walking close together. I accidentally let the back of my hand brush against her leg as we moved. I wanted to see how she would react to a little physical contact. She didn't flinch or pull away. She just blushed even harder. She had no idea that her positive reaction only made me hate her more. It proved that her icy personality was just a shield she used against people she didn't find attractive or successful. I realized that all that coldness and distance she'd shown me in my first life had been reserved exclusively for me. She was perfectly capable of being warm and flirtatious when she thought a man was worth her time. The realization was like a knife to the gut. Over the next week, I went out of my way to find excuses to talk to her, slowly building up a layer of flirtatious tension between us. She didn't push me away at all. In fact, she seemed to really enjoy the subtle attention I was giving her. She wasn't quite ready to commit to a formal dinner date yet, but we started a routine of eating lunch together in the university dining hall every day. It became an unspoken agreement between us. I was slowly becoming a fixture in her daily life. I was playing the long game and wasn't in any rush to push things further. I knew that according to the timeline, her father's health was about to fail again. Sure enough, she walked into the office one morning looking completely frazzled and distracted. When the other professors asked if she was okay, she just brushed them off and wouldn't say a word. I knew exactly what was happening because it was the same week her father had collapsed in my previous life. The diagnosis was about to hit them like a freight train. I kept my mouth shut about what I knew and just continued our subtle flirting. Eventually, during one of our lunches, she started asking me a lot of pointed questions about the healthcare system in the States. She was clearly looking for options for her father. Her family was strictly middle class, and while they could probably manage domestic treatments, international healthcare costs would be astronomical for them. They were staring down a financial abyss. I could see the desperation starting to creep into her eyes. I caught her looking at me several times like she wanted to ask for help, but she always stopped herself at the last second. I knew she was desperate for money, but was terrified of ruining the sophisticated image she had built up in front of me. She wanted my help, but didn't want to look like a beggar. I played dumb and just watched her struggle from the sidelines like I was a spectator at a movie. I was curious to see how long she would try to handle it on her own. I knew that soon enough, her parents would start pressuring her to find a wealthy man to solve their problems. In my first life, she hadn't been dating anyone and didn't have any emotional attachments, so marrying me for money had been a purely business transaction. This time was different because she actually had feelings for the new me. That made the situation much more complicated for her. It didn't take long for the perfect opportunity to present itself. I asked her out for dinner after work like I usually did, but she just stared at me with tearful eyes and shook her head. She grabbed her purse and ran out of the office without saying a single word. I decided to follow her at a distance, tracking her as she left the campus grounds. She eventually ducked into a high-end steakhouse downtown. I watched from across the street to see what she was up to. She was sitting at a window table across from a middle-aged, overweight man who looked to be at least in his late 40s. He was staring at her with these tiny, greedy eyes that were practically squinting glinting with lust. He looked like the definition of a sleazy businessman. It was obvious her parents had set her up on a blind date with some wealthy provider. Before long, the guy started trying to touch her hand and lean in too close, and I could see Miriam visibly recoiling in disgust. She looked like she wanted to crawl out of her skin. The guy clearly didn't handle rejection well, because he started pointing his finger at her and shouting something that made Miriam go pale. He was making such a scene that people at the surrounding tables were starting to stare and whisper. The situation was getting ugly fast. Miriam finally snapped and threw her glass of water right into his face. The guy went absolutely berserk, lunging across the table at her with a look of pure rage. This was the moment I had been waiting for to make my entrance. I didn't waste another second. I sprinted into the restaurant and reached the table just as the man was pulling his hand back to strike her. Miriam had her eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the blow when I yelled at him to stop. I caught him with a solid side kick that sent him tumbling backward over a chair. He let out a pathetic yelp, which finally made Miriam open her eyes. She looked up and saw me standing there like a shield, and I immediately pulled her into a protective embrace. I kept my voice low and full of concern, asking her why she hadn't come to me for help instead of doing this. She just buried her face in my chest and started sobbing uncontrollably. The wall she'd built up around herself had finally crumbled. After we left the restaurant, I walked her back to her quiet office so she could compose herself. Between ragged sobs, she slowly started to explain the nightmare she had been living through for the past few weeks. It was exactly what I had expected. Her parents were convinced that getting her father to a specialist in the U.S. was his only chance at survival. Because they couldn't afford it, they had been relentlessly bullying her into finding a wealthy husband who could pay the medical bills. They were treating her like a piece of property to be sold off. When she finished talking, she looked up at me with these big, tear-filled eyes that were full of desperate hope. She asked me right then and there if I would be willing to marry her. It was the ultimate test. I put on my best performance, looking down at the floor and telling her how sorry I was, but claiming I didn't have that kind of money. Her face went completely ghost white, and the light in her eyes just vanished. She looked like she had lost her last reason to live. She whispered that she truly loved me, but said she couldn't just let her father die without trying everything. She told me to just forget about her and then turned to run out of the room. It was like a scene straight out of a melodrama. I chased after her and grabbed her arm, making sure my face looked like I was torn apart by the situation. Miriam actually stopped and reached out to stroke my cheek, looking like she was the one who felt sorry for me. It was almost funny how well my plan was working. She told me not to feel bad and said she didn't blame me for not being able to help. She suggested that maybe we just weren't meant to be together and promised she wouldn't let that creep from the restaurant come after me. She was actually trying to protect me. I almost felt a twinge of guilt because she seemed so sincere in her misery. I took her hands in mine and asked her if she was seriously going through with marrying that disgusting guy. I needed to hear her say it. She looked up at me with a sudden, tragic determination in her eyes. Before I could say anything else, she leaned in and pressed her lips against mine. It was the first time she had ever initiated anything like that. The kiss went on for what felt like forever. I could tell immediately that she was completely inexperienced and had no idea what she was doing. I took over, gently showing her how it was supposed to feel. I only let go once I felt her go limp in my arms. Her breathing was heavy, and she couldn't even meet my eyes. She whispered for me to forget her one last time before she hurried away. I stood there watching her walk away, tasting the lingering scent of her perfume. In my first life, I hadn't even gotten a peck on the cheek from her, so taking her first kiss now felt like a small bit of justice. I didn't feel bad about it at all. I knew I could have had her right then if I really wanted to, but the timing wasn't right yet. I was holding out for the moment when she was completely, hopelessly obsessed with me. I wanted her to love me so much that she'd turn her back on the entire world just to stay by my side. Miriam spent the whole next morning avoiding me, and I made sure to give her plenty of space. When lunchtime rolled around, I could see her constantly glancing over at my desk, clearly expecting me to walk over like I always did. I just ignored her. I skipped the cafeteria entirely and headed straight for the campus gates. From the corner of my eye, I saw her standing there, looking absolutely devastated as she watched me walk away. I wanted her to feel that sense of loss. I treated myself to a nice steak dinner in town and took my sweet time getting back. I didn't return to the university until the work day was almost over. I wanted to make sure she spent the whole day worrying about where I was. As I got close to the main gate, I saw a flashy BMW blocking the entrance. That same disgusting guy from the restaurant was there again, gripping Miriam's arm tightly while she tried to pull away. It was the perfect setup for another intervention. I broke into a run, making sure I looked completely panicked and out of breath by the time I reached them. Right in front of a crowd of students, I screamed at the guy to get his hands off my girlfriend. Miriam looked like she'd seen a ghost. The guy gave me a look of pure contempt contempt and told me I was lucky he hadn't called the cops on me the night before. He asked if I was really stupid enough to come back for round 2. He clearly thought he was the alpha in this situation. I almost wanted to tell the old fool that I was actually doing him a massive favor. If he actually managed to marry her, she'd probably have him dead and buried within 5 years to get to his money. He had no idea what kind of person she really was. I had to keep up the act though, so I put on a stubborn, protective face and told him one last time to get away from her. I made sure to sound as serious as possible. I wanted to make a scene that everyone would remember. His hand shook a bit as he flicked his cigarette, and he laughed at the idea of me being her boyfriend. He bragged about the $500,000 dowry he'd promised her parents and asked what a broke academic like me could possibly offer her. He thought his wallet made him untouchable. The crowd of students and faculty started buzzing immediately. People were already disgusted by the idea of a bought marriage, especially since Miriam was so beautiful and this guy looked like a human thumb. It was a humiliating situation for her to be in. To everyone watching, it was painfully obvious that she wasn't there by choice. The whispers from the crowd were getting louder, and I watched Miriam bow her head in shame. She looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. I stepped in front of her to block their stares and yelled at the crowd to mind their own business. I told everyone that her father was dying of cancer and that she was only being forced into this because of the medical bills. I made her out to be a tragic martyr. Miriam just collapsed into my arms, weeping into my shirt while I gently wiped her tears away. It was a perfect emotional climax for everyone watching. I could see the sympathy on people's faces. The guy was turning purple with rage and screaming that she was his fiancée now. I just took my backpack off and slammed it onto the pavement, telling him that if all it took was $500,000, I had the cash right here. I opened the zipper just enough for him to see the stacks. When I pulled the bag open to reveal the thick bundles of $100 bills, the entire crowd went silent. Miriam looked like she was about to faint and asked me where on earth I'd gotten that kind of money. It was a massive amount of cash to be carrying around. I ran my fingers through her hair and told her I had sold the condo my parents had bought for my future wedding the moment I heard about her father. I lied through my teeth, making myself sound like the most selfless man on earth. She looked at me with pure adoration. Miriam just clung to me, her whole body shaking with sobs. The sleazy guy stared at the money for a few seconds, looking almost relieved to have an excuse to get out of the deal. He hopped into his BMW and sped away as fast as he could. When we got back to her parents' place and showed them the money, their eyes practically turned into dollar signs. Miriam just stood there watching them, looking both relieved that the debt was paid and utterly disgusted by their greed. She was finally starting to see them for who they really were. She told them she was staying with me, but they didn't even bother to look up from the stacks of cash they were counting. They just waved her off and told her to do whatever she wanted as long as they had the money. It was a pathetic display of parenting. That was the final straw for Miriam, and I could see the last bit of affection she had for them die right then. She grabbed my hand and told me she wanted to leave immediately. I was more than happy to oblige. I took her back to my small faculty apartment on campus, which was pretty modest compared to what I could actually afford. We sat on the edge of my bed, and I told her how sorry I was that she'd have to live such a simple life with me. I wanted to see if she was really committed. She cut me off with a kiss before I could finish my sentence. Her eyes were full of love as she whispered into my ear that she was completely mine now. It was the moment she finally gave herself to me completely. I've been waiting for this moment for 3 long years. Being with her this time felt entirely different because I knew I actually had her heart. She wasn't just staying with me out of obligation. She was truly in love with the man she thought I was. She was open to everything I wanted, things she would have never even considered doing with me in our first life. As the sun started to come up, I watched her sleeping peacefully and couldn't help but let a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. I had her exactly where I wanted her. I thought about how I had worshipped her like a goddess in my first life, only to have her treat me like dirt. This time around, I was the one in control of the narrative. She had no idea she was sleeping next to her own executioner. Miriam moved into my tiny apartment and never once complained about the lack of space or luxury. She actually turned into a housewife, doing the grocery shopping and keeping the place spotless after her lectures were done. It was a complete role reversal from our previous life. She even insisted on hand washing my laundry every single day. When the sun went down, she was more than eager to give herself to me in every way possible. She was desperate to prove her devotion to to me. I have to admit, the physical connection was significantly better than anything we'd had before because of the emotional intensity she felt. We lived in this bubble of domestic bliss for about 6 months, but I knew the peace wouldn't last forever. I did some quick mental math and realized that the initial $500,000 I gave them must be nearly gone by now. In my previous life, I'd spent millions more than that just to keep her father alive through all the complications. Without a steady stream of cash, they were going to run out of options very soon. Back then, I had paid for the top specialists and private clinics to keep him breathing. This time, I wasn't going to be their endless bank account. I was curious to see how much longer they could survive on that single lump sum. They had no idea how expensive living and getting treatment in the States actually was. I came home one afternoon to find Miriam staring blankly out the window. I sat down next to her and gently asked what was bothering her. With tears in her eyes, she told me that her mother had called to say they were completely out of money. I closed my eyes and put on a show of being devastated, even suggesting that I should start driving for Uber at night to make extra cash. I wanted to see how she'd respond to me sacrificing even more. Miriam immediately shut that idea down, telling me that I didn't owe her parents anything else. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. It meant she was finally starting to prioritize me over her toxic family. She had finally chosen me over her own parents. It was clear evidence that her obsession with me had reached the point of no return. I had officially won the battle for her loyalty. I kept up the act of being the dutiful son-in-law, saying that I already considered them my own family, even without a marriage certificate. Miriam sat in silence for a long time before she finally announced she was going to sell her parents' remaining property back home. She was willing to burn every bridge for me. I tried to protest, asking her where she would live if things didn't work out with us. She looked at me with a cold, hard determination and said she had already paid her debt to her parents many times over. This house was going to be her final contribution to their lives. She curled up in my arms and whispered that once the house was gone, I would be the only thing she had left in the world. She asked me to promise I would never leave her. I gave her a solemn nod, pretending to be her rock. The real estate market in Boston was hot, so the house sold in less than a week. Even though it was a modest place in the suburbs, it still brought in over $500,000. It was a significant amount of money for her to be holding. To my surprise, Miriam only sent half of the proceeds to her parents and transferred the rest directly into my bank account. She told me to keep it as a nest egg so we could eventually buy a place of our own. She was fully invested in our future together. I played along, even though I was secretly thrilled to have the extra cash. I was also getting tired of living in a cramped apartment on campus. I was a wealthy man, after all, and I had no intention of spending the rest of my life in student housing. A week later, I drove Miriam out to a stunning estate on the outskirts of the city. She looked at the sprawling lawn and the massive house in awe, asking if this was the property I had mentioned my friend needed help managing. She couldn't believe her eyes. I told her it belonged to an old classmate from Stanford who was living abroad and needed someone to keep an eye on it. I explained that since he wasn't planning on selling it anytime soon, we could live there as long as we liked. She was absolutely thrilled. Miriam was so excited that she practically tackled me with a hug. We settled into the luxury of the estate, and for the next 6 months, our lives were incredibly peaceful. It was the calm before the storm. Then, the inevitable happened. Her mother called, begging for more money. She claimed that the first surgery hadn't been successful and that her father's condition had taken a sharp turn for the worse, requiring another expensive procedure. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing right there. In my previous life, I had flown in the world's best surgeons and paid for the most cutting-edge treatments to save that man. This time, they were stuck with whatever the basic insurance would cover. I remembered how he'd used his recovery time in my first life to plot against me and convince Miriam to leave. Without my bottomless bank account to support him now, I knew he was likely on his deathbed. His luck had finally run out. Miriam's voice was like ice as she told her mother to stop calling because she was broke. Her mother went into a frenzy, screaming about the couple $100,000 they knew was left over from the house sale. She was relentless. Miriam just gave a short, bitter laugh and said that she and her husband needed that money for their own future. Her mother started screaming that we weren't even legally married and that I wasn't part of the family. She was losing her mind. Miriam stayed completely calm and told her mother that I wanted to wait until we were more financially stable before getting married. She pointed out that if they hadn't extorted that huge sum from me earlier, we would have already been husband and wife. She was finally throwing their greed back in their faces. That comment seemed to break her mother completely, and she started screaming insults and calling Miriam an ungrateful, boy-crazy lunatic. Miriam didn't even flinch. She just calmly ended the call while her mother was still mid-sentence. She was done with them. Her stance was crystal clear now. She had decided to let her parents sink or swim on their own. I couldn't help but be impressed by how cold she could be once she'd redirected her obsession toward a man. It was a terrifying trait. A few days later, we got word from the hospital that her father had passed away. To make matters worse, her mother was being detained because of the unpaid medical bills and couldn't even leave the country. They were completely stranded and broke. It was a total collapse for her family, and her mother ended up homeless on the streets of a foreign city. Miriam didn't even bother to fly over for the funeral. She just signed the paperwork over the phone to donate his body to science and closed the book on him. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated joy. I went into the backyard where I could be alone and just let out a silent cheer. It felt incredibly good to see them finally get what they deserved. The satisfaction was beyond words. This was so much better than if I had killed him myself. I wondered if the old man felt the sting of his favorite daughter's betrayal before he died. It must have been a much slower, more painful death than the one they gave me. Those two old parasites finally got exactly what was coming to them. Now, the only person left on my list was Joey. According to my timeline, he was due to arrive back in the city in about 6 months. I wasn't even slightly worried about whether he would try to pursue Miriam again. A guy like Joey couldn't resist a beautiful woman, especially one who was now as radiant and successful as Miriam. I knew he wouldn't be able to help himself. In this timeline, Miriam was even more stunning and vibrant than she had been before, mostly because she actually felt loved and secure. She was the perfect bait for a man like him. I just had to wait for him to take the hook. With her father gone and her mother missing, Miriam became completely obsessed with me. She spent every waking moment catering to my needs, and at night, she would cling to me like a frightened child. She was terrified of the idea of losing the only person she had left. It was the behavior of someone who had lost everything and was desperately clinging to their last lifeline. She started bringing up the subject of marriage more frequently, though she was always very careful not to push me too hard. She was clearly anxious for the security of a legal commitment. Every time she brought it up, I gave her a gentle but firm refusal. I kept using the excuse that we needed to be more financially secure before we took such a big step. I wanted to keep her on edge and keep her wanting more. After a few rejections, she finally stopped asking altogether, though I could see it was eating her alive. I'll admit there were moments where I actually felt a tiny bit of guilt for what I was doing to her. It was hard to remain completely cold when someone was so devoted to you. I wasn't a robot, and after months of her treating me like a king, it was hard not to feel a lingering affection for her. But then I would remember the image of her and Joey standing together while I was pushed to the edge of that roof. That memory always brought back the cold, hard hatred I needed to finish this. I'd have to give myself a reality check and remind myself not to be so pathetic. I had to remember exactly what she was capable of when it suited her. Once that reminder hit me, any shred of sympathy I had would instantly vanish. We lived in that strange, tense peace for another 6 months. Then, one Tuesday morning, the department chair walked into the office with a new faculty member. I knew the moment I saw him that the final act had begun. The chair apologized for the interruption and introduced the new addition to the department. He announced that Joey Thompson would be joining the faculty as a new professor. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I looked at his familiar, punchable face. I watched as Joey stood there, looking all charming and confident, and I couldn't help but feel a dark sense of satisfaction. He started making his rounds, introducing himself and scanning the room to see who was worth his time. I was just another face in the crowd to him. He had an Ivy League pedigree that made my Stanford master's look like a community college degree. He was a genuine academic superstar. Once he finished his speech, he walked straight over to Miriam's desk and offered her his hand with a cocky grin. He introduced himself with a smooth, flirtatious tone that made my skin crawl. For a split second, I wondered if he had also come back from the future because his moves were so bold. But then I realized he was just his usual arrogant self. Miriam didn't even look up from her paperwork, keeping her expression completely frozen. Joey was left standing there with his hand out like an idiot while his face turned a bright shade of red. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The rest of the staff were clearly struggling not to laugh out loud, and I could see their shoulders shaking as they watched the scene unfold. Harrison finally stepped in to break the tension and move things along. It was a humiliating start for the Golden Boy. Harrison tried to play it off as a joke, telling Joey that Miriam was notoriously private and only had eyes for me. He joked that she barely even spoke to the department head, so Joey shouldn't take the rejection personally. He was essentially telling Joey that she was off limits. The whole room had a good laugh at Joey's expense, while Harrison tried to save him some dignity. Joey finally turned his attention to me, realizing that I was the guy standing in his way. He looked me up and down like he was measuring a rival. He walked over to my desk and offered a polite hand, asking for my name. I stood up and gave him a calm, friendly smile as I introduced myself as Edward. I could feel the competitive energy radiating off him. There wasn't a hint of recognition in his eyes, just a subtle, competitive competitive glint. I realized then that he wasn't a time traveler, he was just a naturally arrogant jerk. That made things a lot easier for me. After we finished the introductions, it was time for his demonstration lecture. He spent the entire session pacing the front of the room like a rock star, constantly trying to catch Miriam's eye. He was performing for her benefit rather than the students. His lecture was full of unnecessary technical jargon and flashy visuals, which was clearly an attempt to show off how smart he was. It was a total waste of energy because Miriam sat right next to me with her head down, completely ignoring him the entire time. She couldn't have cared less about his credentials. He finally got frustrated with being ignored and tried to force her to engage by calling on her for a question. He specifically asked Professor Miller if she could give her thoughts on a complex point he'd just made. He was trying to corner her in front of the whole staff. Miriam looked up with an expression that could have frozen fire and told him bluntly that she wasn't one of his students. The whole room went dead silent, and Joey just stood there with his mouth open, completely humiliated. It was absolutely perfect. Even Harrison was starting to get annoyed by Joey's obvious attempts to flirt during a professional review. He snapped at Joey, telling him to focus on his lecture instead of trying to be clever and show off. Joey was quickly burning through his welcome. It was rare to see the dean lose his temper, so Joey finally got the hint and shut up. He finished the rest of his presentation without any more antics, looking like a scolded dog. I enjoyed every second of his discomfort. As soon as we got back to the house that evening, I made sure to let my expression drop into a dark, brooding mask. I wanted her to feel the weight of my displeasure. I was setting the stage for a little psychological manipulation. Miriam looked terrified as I asked her if she knew Joey from somewhere. She started waving her hands frantically, swearing that she had never seen him before in her life. She was so desperate to please me that she was practically shaking. I narrowed my eyes and asked why he'd been so focused on her if they were total strangers. I suggested that his behavior made it look like they had some kind of history together. I wanted her to feel guilty for even being the object of his attention. She looked like she was about to burst into tears, clearly overwhelmed by the unfairness of the situation. She couldn't explain why a complete stranger would be acting so obsessed with her. She was the perfect victim of my gaslighting. I decided to drop the subject for now, since I had achieved my goal. I just wanted to plant a seed of resentment toward Joey in her mind. I wanted her to associate his very existence with my anger. I needed her to believe that anything Joey did would directly threaten our relationship. Joey was doing a great job of playing the villain without even knowing he was part of my script. He was falling right in my trap. Ever since he started working at the university, he'd find any excuse to be near her desk or talk to her in the halls. Every single time he tried to strike up a conversation, she would instinctively look over at me with a panicked expression. She was terrified of how I'd react. I always acted like I didn't notice a thing, letting him make a fool of himself while he pursued her. But the moment we got home, I'd turn up the psychological pressure, making her feel like she was failing me just by being in the same room as him. I was slowly breaking her down. She became increasingly timid and desperate to please me whenever we were alone. At the same time, the way she looked at Joey went from indifference to pure, unadulterated hatred. He was becoming the source of all her stress. Once I had planted that seed of hatred, everything Joey did only serve to make it grow. He was unwittingly providing the water and fertilizer for her resentment to bloom into something truly dangerous. He was sealing his own fate with every flirtatious comment. I let this situation simmer for over 6 months, slowly ratcheting up the tension until it was ready to snap. One morning, I made a point of skipping work and not showing up at the office. I wanted to see what he'd do when he thought the coast was clear. Without me there to play the protective boyfriend, Joey finally decided to make a big move. I watched from a hidden corner as he literally cornered her and dragged her into the stairwell. He was finally showing his true colors. I had positioned myself on the floor just below them so I could hear everything through the echoey stairwell. Joey was shouting at her, his hands gripping her shoulders as he confessed his obsession. He sounded completely unhinged. He was screaming about how she wasn't even married to me and demanding to know why she wouldn't give him a fair shot. Miriam was fighting back with everything she had, screaming for him to take his hands off her. It was a violent, ugly scene. Joey seemed to have completely lost his grip on reality, yelling that he'd never let her go. He kept comparing himself to me, promising her a better life if she would just give in to him. He was desperate and dangerous. He even started bragging about his academic publications, claiming he had a much brighter future than I did. I almost wanted to laugh as I listened from below. He really thought his CV would make up for his complete lack of character. On paper, he was definitely the more impressive candidate compared to a guy who just stumbled into money. But he was too stupid to realize that love and obsession don't follow the rules of a resume. He was fighting a war he had already lost. One thing was for sure, though, Joey was just as much of an idiot in love as I had been in my first glamorous life. It was sickening to realize that I had been killed by two people who were both this incredibly stupid. I had been a victim of their collective idiocy. I couldn't believe I'd let my life be ruined by these two emotional train wrecks. Miriam didn't back down for a second, telling him in a voice as cold as a grave that if he didn't stop, she would make him regret the day he was born. She meant every word. Joey had completely snapped and pinned her against the concrete wall, trying to force himself on her. I sprinted up the stairs and burst through the door just as he was leaning in to kiss her against her will. It was the moment I needed to finalize the psychological break. I let out a roar of rage, just as Joey let out a piercing scream of pain. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his crotch while sweat poured down his face. Miriam had clearly delivered a very effective kick before I even reached them. Miriam looked at me with pure terror, trying to explain that the situation wasn't what it looked like. I didn't say a word, just gave her a look of utter disappointment and walked away. I wanted that image of me leaving her to be burned into her brain. When we got home, I immediately moved all my things into the guest room and locked the door. Miriam spent the entire night outside, sobbing and begging for me to just talk to her, but I didn't give her an inch of ground. I slept like a baby while she fell apart in the hallway. I opened the door the next morning to find her still kneeling there, looking like a ghost. 6 months of constant psychological pressure had finally broken her spirit completely. She looked like she was on the verge of a total psychotic break. She looked up at me with these bloodshot, desperate eyes, swearing on her life that he hadn't actually touched her. I didn't even acknowledge her existence, just stepped over her and walked toward the bathroom like she was a piece of furniture. The silence was my most powerful weapon. She had to use the wall for support as she tried to follow me because her legs were so cramped from kneeling on the hardwood floor all night. She could barely even stand up. I felt no pity for her at all. I knew this was the moment to finally finish her off. I turned and looked at her with a cold, dead gaze, telling her that I wasn't blind and that I'd seen exactly what happened in that stairwell. I made sure my voice was completely devoid of emotion. I asked her if she would have just gone ahead and slept with him if I hadn't interrupted them. She just collapsed back on her knees with a heavy thud, her whole body shaking so hard she couldn't even speak. She had no defense left. I kept the pressure on, asking her how I could possibly trust her when I was at work. I suggested that for all I knew, they had been sleeping together for months behind my back. I was destroying the very foundation of her identity. She sat in silence for several minutes before she finally managed to pull herself up. She whispered that she would find a way to prove her loyalty to me once and for all. Then she just walked out the front door with a strange, blank look on her face. I got dressed and followed her at a safe distance. She looked like she was in a trance as she walked down the street and into a hardware store. A few minutes later, she came out carrying a heavy black plastic bag. She didn't head home. She went straight toward the campus instead. Since it was the weekend and there were no classes, I knew she wasn't going to her office. It was obvious she was heading for the faculty housing to find Joey. Joey had been assigned to my old faculty apartment while he got settled. I watched Miriam walk up to the door and use her old spare key to let herself in without even knocking. She was on a mission. Joey looked completely shocked to see her standing in his doorway. But she wasn't the cold, distant woman he knew. She actually gave him a dazzling, flirtatious smile and asked him if he really, truly loved her. Joey started nodding like a crazy person, swearing his undying love for her. Miriam sat down on the edge of his bed and asked how she could possibly know if he was telling the truth. She even reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder, drawing him in. Joey, who was still in his pajamas, looked like he had just won the lottery. He told her he'd do anything she wanted, no questions asked. He thought he'd finally broken through her defenses. She gave him this dark, seductive smile and pulled a thick coil of heavy-duty rope out of her bag. She told him she wanted to try something new and proceeded to tie his hands and feet to the bedposts. I realized then exactly what she'd been buying at the store. Joey didn't resist at all, clearly thinking they were about to get into some kinky roleplay. Once she had him completely immobilized, he started begging her to get on top of him. He had no idea he was being trussed up like a Thanksgiving turkey. She just smiled and pressed a finger to his lips before suddenly stuffing a gag into his mouth and securing it with more rope. He tried to protest, but all that came out was a muffled, frantic grunting. The look of panic finally started to set in. I had a sudden flashback to that scene in Basic Instinct, and I realized with a chill exactly what Miriam was planning to do. She reached back in her bag and pulled out a long, serrated hunting knife. I could see the steel glinting in the morning light. While Joey stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, she brought the knife down in one swift, brutal motion. She completely castrated him right there on the bed, cutting through flesh like it was nothing. It was a bloodbath. Joey was thrashing around in total agony, but the gag kept the screams down to a series of pathetic waves. Miriam didn't even look bothered. She just grabbed a Ziploc bag, gathered up the severed parts, and sealed it shut with a look of pure clinical disgust. Finally, she grabbed a pillow and pressed it down over his face, holding it there with a terrifying, calm strength until he stopped breathing. Once it was over, she just turned off the lights and walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind her like she had just finished a routine. It was clear to me then that Miriam had completely lost her mind. She didn't look scared or guilty at all. I stood there in the hall wondering if she'd try to call an ambulance for Joe, but I decided that letting him die like that was almost too kind for what he'd done to me in my first life. Besides, even if he survived, he would have to live the rest of his life as a broken man with nothing left. When Miriam finally got back to the house, she was actually wearing a bright, cheerful smile. She looked like she had just had the best day of her life. She walked up to me and told me that I didn't have to worry about Joey ever. She said it with such casual nonchalance that it made my blood run cold. She was a complete sociopath. I just forced a smile and pulled her into a warm hug. Since I'd been treating her like garbage for the past few days, she seemed genuinely shocked by the sudden affection. She melted into my arms immediately. She was so desperate for my approval that she completely lost herself in my sudden affection. We spent the entire night together in a frantic, desperate haze of embraces. It was the last time we would ever be together. Once she had finally fallen into a deep sleep, I sat up and looked at her one last time. I calmly picked up my phone and dialed 911 to report the murder. The next time I saw her, she was sitting behind a glass partition in county jail. I used some of my fortune to hire the best defense team in the state and made sure she got a full psychological workup. I guess a small part of me still felt something for her, even after everything. I didn't want her to get the death penalty. It's hard to live with someone for that long and not have some lingering attachment, no matter how toxic the relationship was. The trial ended with her being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I felt a strange sense of closure as the verdict was read. As they were leading her out of the courtroom, she looked at me with tearful eyes and begged me not to marry anyone else. She told me I had to wait for her to come home to me. I just gave her a serious nod and promised her I'd wait forever, even though we both knew she would never get it done. She actually looked happy as the guards led her away, comforted by my lie. Once the dust had settled, I resigned from my position at the university and decided to finally start living for myself. I had plenty of money and a clean slate. I thought completing my revenge would feel better, but it mostly just left me feeling hollow. I decided it was time to let go of the anger because Miriam's fate was a punishment worse than death. I was finally satisfied with the outcome. I didn't even bother looking for her mother, who was likely still struggling somewhere on the streets of the foreign city. Letting go of my pursuit of her was the only way I was ever going to find any way to peace. I needed to move on. I realized that just living a good, comfortable life was the best revenge I could ever have. We spend so much of our lives trying to prove our worth to people who don't care about us. We want to show them we're lovable, but we also want to show them we have the power to tear their world down if we choose. The real tragedy of my story is that by the time I finally pushed them into the abyss, I realized I'd lost myself along the way. That insecure, desperate version of me had died right alongside them during the process. Revenge had stripped me of my own humanity. True victory isn't about watching your enemies suffer. It's about reaching the point where you don't care if they're dead or alive. Some debts have to be settled, and sometimes you get a second chance, just so you can say a final goodbye. I had finally reached that point of forgiveness. If you've ever been betrayed like I was, just remember that personal growth isn't about impressing your enemies. It's about building enough self-worth to know that you deserve better than the people who try to break you. You have to be your own hero. You need to bury those painful memories along with the people who caused them. Only when you stop looking back at the wreckage of the past can you finally see the possibilities of the future. My life is just beginning now. Life is far too short to waste it on old days. Instead of drowning in the past, I'm choosing to build something beautiful out of the ruins of my old life. I'm finally free.